So, should I get started?
All right, well, let me get started and start the
Okay.
section and introduce everyone, and then I'll hand it over to you.
Okay.
All right, thank you everyone for coming to support Olivia for her thesis defense for Barrett the Honors College. My name is Georgette Briggs. I am her thesis director for the pathway that Olivia has been enrolled in for the past year as she's been undertaking this research. I just want the other members of the committee, Shirvin and Dr. Haas, if you can each introduce yourselves, and then we'll start with Olivia's presentation. So just for an idea of how the session is going to go, Olivia will present her thesis defense slides and her project. I'll then open up the floor to questions from everyone present about the presentation. Then the committee will be free to ask questions about the presentation. We'll have a section where we'll, on Zoom, sort of go into a little breakout room, and the committee will meet with Olivia separately to go through her report if there are any issues that we want to talk about there. And then after that meeting, which should be brief, we'll sort of come back to the main room and confer our decision. Okay, so please, Dr. Haas, if you want to introduce yourself, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Georgette. My name is Mark Hass. I'm a professor of practice in the W.P. Carey School of Business, where I teach marketing strategy and leadership. I'm a former global CEO of several large marketing firms, including Edelman and MS&L Worldwide. I come without an academic background, but with professional credential.
Thank you so much for serving on Olivia's committee as well.
Pleasure.
Yes. I should run over to you, sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. So my name's Shirvin Zeinalzadeh. I'm from the School of Politics and Global Studies here at Arizona State University. I'm a former diplomat and I'm here to support Olivia for this. I specialize in the Middle East region, so having an active interest in the Middle East and particularly in aviation, I think I've been able to assist Olivia as best I can. So I'm looking forward to this, and thank you to everyone else for being here. It's good that we're all here to support her.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone. So, Olivia, I'll hand the floor over to you now. So please go
All
ahead.
right. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olivia Duncan. I'm sure you're all here for me. And today I'm presenting my honors thesis titled The Flag in Her Skirt, Airlines as National Brands and Soft Power. And this project examines how flag carrier airlines construct and project national identity through their branding systems and the social media presence, and how that branding functions as a form of soft power in the global arena. So I just want to give a little bit of background context. I am currently an international relations student here at ASU, and this project really grew out of a convergence of a personal experience and my academic curiosity. So during my third year, I studied abroad at the University of Manchester. While I was there, I flew a number of different airlines around Europe and even to Morocco. And it was during that time that I started really noticing how differently these airlines present themselves, not just in terms of service quality, but in terms of the national image that they plan to project. So the colors, the uniform, the language that they use, the in-flight experience, I felt like all of that was very deliberately curated. And so while I was at Manchester, the University of Manchester, I took an international business module that examined how airlines operate within the global economy. And we spent some time looking at a case study on Singapore Airlines. And that was really the first moment where I started connecting what I was experiencing when I went on these flights with what I was learning in the classroom about international business strategy, state investment, and national branding. And I thought, airlines are not just transport companies, they're deeply embedded in international commerce. And yeah, so I worked with a professor there who is here today, Dr. Hannah, and I brought it back to ASU and worked with Shirvin and Georgette and Dr. Mark Hass. And yeah. So let's look at the first concept, which is soft power. We really have to, define this foundational concept. So soft power is defined by Joseph Nye, who was a political scientist. He defined it in 1990. It's the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion. So it is a country's capacity to shape the preferences and behaviors of others, not by threatening them or using warfare or paying them, but by making them what you want. And it works through culture, so through values and through image, and it's not using, military force or economic sanctions. And I think it operates, without the audience being entirely conscious that it's happening. It's more subliminal. So, two of the most commonly cited examples that I've used here on the slide are K-pop and Hollywood. So, South Korea, through the global spread of K-pop groups and Korean dramas, Korean cinema, all that K-beauty and everything, has managed to export Korean beauty standards, their fashion trends, their language, and their cultural customs to audiences all around the world. And most of these audiences didn't even set out to learn anything about Korean culture. They just started watching a show or listening to a song or applying makeup, and that's the cultural influence that followed. And Hollywood as well has essentially done the same thing with American values and lifestyles for the past century, since Hollywood was curated. When audiences around the world watch American films, they are absorbing ideas about individualism, consumer culture, freedom of expression, and overall the American way of life. And they're not actively thinking about it. That influence is, again, in many ways subliminal. And that's precisely what makes soft power so effective. It works through attraction, not instruction, and it reaches people in spaces where they weren't even expecting to be influenced. So, specifically, soft power in airlines, with that understanding, airlines are one of the most visible soft power instruments that a state has, and yet they're not always discussed, in those terms. A flag carrier, which is an airline that is designated for which is widely recognized as the national airline of a country, carries that country's name, its colors, and its cultural codes to millions of people before a single diplomatic conversation has even taken place. So every time, a Qatar Airways plane lands at Heathrow or a Turkish Airlines flight boards in New York, those countries are being represented to an international audience through its branding, through their service, and through the aesthetic experience itself in the flight. Now, on the side, you'll see a quote from my literature that I found, which compares the role of Coca-Cola in the American identity projection to the role of Turkish Airlines in the Turkish identity projection. And this comparison might seem kind of unusual at first if you're not familiar with it, but Coca-Cola has been so central to the projection of American culture abroad that the term Coca-Cola colonization was coined as early as 1949 to describe the globalization of American consumer and capitalist culture through products like Coke. And even nowadays, it has this patriotic branding, and I do believe that the president of the United States has informally endorsed it. And I think the point here is that a commercial brand can become so thoroughly identified with a country that it functions as a vehicle for national identity, whether or not that is the stated intention. And that is exactly what flag carriers do. So Turkish Airlines, for example, carries the Turkish flag on its livery. It serves Turkish cuisine on board, and it sponsors cultural and sporting events globally, all of which reinforces that kind of image that Turkey is a modern, connected, and culturally rich nation. Another concept that we need to understand is what national identity actually is. So we're going to be drawing on Benedict Anderson's 1983 work, which he refers to national identity as the shared symbols, stories, and values that make a group of people feel belonging to the same nation and distinguish them from others. And it is, in Anderson's terms, a kind of an imagined community because those members of that nation will most likely, they're not all going to meet each other, but they share this sense of belonging. And specifically in airline branding, national identity manifests itself in the visual, like visual cues. So it is the flags painted on the tail fins, it's the national colors that's woven into the cabin interiors, it's the language used in announcements, the social media posts, and of course, the uniforms worn by cabin crew. And on this slide, you can see a Singapore Airlines flight attendant wearing the sarong kabaya, which is one of the most recognizable national symbols in Southeast Asian culture. The sarong kebaya is not simply a uniform choice, it is deeply rooted in the cultural heritage of Singapore and their wider Malay communities. In fact, in 2024, the kebaya was formally inscribed on UNESCO's representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity through a joint nomination of 5 Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore. It continues to be worn at weddings, festivals, and national celebrations across the region. And Singapore Airlines has even sold a junior version of the sarong kebaya through their retail platforms, marketed as a children's outfit so that young girls can dress in the same uniform as the Singapore girl. That is just how deeply embedded this garment is as a symbol of national and brand identity. And it's just one of the examples how airlines use these visual cues like uniforms, flags, and languages to communicate this is who we are to a global audience. So this leads directly into another concept that we're looking at, which is aesthetic labor. And this is very central to my thesis because aesthetic labor refers to the process by which airlines turn the embodied appearance of their cabin crew, their uniforms, their grooming, their posture, the way they speak, into a managed corporate resource. And it's not about, looking professional. It's all about looking like they're the national brand. They're carrying the brand identity of an entire country on their body. And what is particularly important to note here is that the burden falls disproportionately on female cabin crew, which we will see later in the results. The grooming standards, the weight requirements, the uniform expectations, all of those tend to be significantly more rigid for the female cabin crew. And the most iconic example of this is the Singapore Girl, of course, which has been a central element of Singapore Airlines' marketing since 1972, when Balmain was hired to redesign the sarong kebaya uniform. Singapore Girl is not just a marketing slogan. It has become, as Obendorf says, Singapore's most recognizable ambassador. Even a wax figure of the Singapore Girl was placed in Madame Tussauds in London in 1994, making it the first wax figure in the museum's history to represent a commercial brand. But there are negative aspects to this, where the Singapore Girl has been criticized for reducing female cabin crew to a kind of caricature of idealized Asian femininity, one that emphasizes submissiveness, grace, and physical beauty in a way that puts, an emphasis on an emphasis and a weight on the bodies of these individual women. So the question becomes, where is this branding all really being seen? And increasingly, of course, the answer is social media, as social media has gotten much popular in the last decade. This presence is no longer optional for airlines. It functions as a necessity and a necessary channel for promotion and information sharing, and even direct consumer interaction. From Facebook to Instagram, major carriers have long integrated these platforms as core components of their engagement strategies. What has changed in the recent years is the platform landscape themselves. So traditional marketing channels like magazine advertisements and television commercials are no longer the primary way that airlines reach their audiences. Social media, and particularly platforms like TikTok and Instagram, have become the more efficient and effective channel for airline marketing. And that is especially true with Gen Z and younger millennials, and since they spend most of their time on these websites and social media platforms. And they allow the airlines to reach a much far wider and more geographically diverse audience than cable television advertisements ever could. So a single TikTok video from Emirates can reach millions of viewers in dozens of countries within hours of posting, which is something a magazine spread simply cannot replace. And these platforms reward visually engaging, shareable content, and so that makes them particularly well suited to the kind of aesthetic and identity rich branding that airlines specialize in. So I have 3 headlines here where I'm showing aesthetic labor in action. The first, from 2022, discusses how Asian airlines beauty standards remain, in the words of the article, they're stuck in the dark ages. The grooming requirements for cabin crew of many airlines are extraordinarily strict. Even Emirates, for example, requires that all cabin crew have healthy teeth with no visible decay, no braces, no missing teeth, and candidates must complete a dental examination as part of the hiring process. So that shows in the report here from 2025, where Emirates crew members are being fired for weight and grooming violations just because they are so strict. But there is also the second headline, also from 2022, about Virgin Atlantic introducing gender-neutral uniforms. Virgin has actively tried to diversify how their cabin crew present themselves, and they're pushing more towards a model that prioritizes inclusion and individual expression over rigid aesthetic conformity. So this is a very different approach from what you see at Emirates, and where the brand identity is kind of built on a highly specific and tightly controlled visual presentation. Now I want to move into the structural side of this, which is ownership. And understanding who owns an airline matters because it shapes the relationship between the airline and the state, and therefore the degree to which the airline is expected or incentivized to project national identity. So the first category we have is, of course, state-owned, and in that model, the government holds full or majority ownership of the airline, and the airline operates under a direct national mandate. Its branding, its route network, and its strategic priorities are closely aligned with state interests. The three state-owned carriers that I chose in my sample are Air China, Qatar Airways, and Emirates. And for these airlines, projecting the nation is not incidental to the business model. It is kind of, the purpose of the business model. And these airlines exist, at least, in part, to make their countries visible, attractive, and economically connected in the global stage. The second category is hybrid. So these are airlines that have been partially privatized but still retain significant shareholding or strong historical ties to the state. The hybrid carriers in my sample are Singapore Airlines, Air France, Turkish Airlines, and Cathay Pacific. These airlines operate in a commercial market and answer to stakeholders, but the state still remains enough of a stake or enough of a structural relationship to influence branding and strategic direction. And of course, the third category is private ownership. So these airlines have no meaningful state ownership and answer to shareholders rather than governments. The two private carriers in my sample are British Airways and Virgin Atlantic. So in theory, privately owned airlines have less structural incentive to project national identity because their mandate is commercial and not national. But as we will see in the results, the actual relationship between ownership and national branding is a bit more complicated than the simple framework might suggest. Before we leave the topic of ownership, I do want to introduce one more concept that ties ownership structure to soft power, and that is the idea of a national champion firm. So national champion firm is a state-owned or state-supported enterprise that projects international competitiveness and is of the purpose to advance national economic interests. And these companies are not just commercially successful, but they are strategically important in how a country positions itself internationally. So I've listed three examples here. So South Korea has Samsung, which is a private brand, but is, it's the national champion of South Korea. Boeing as well in the United States, private, but still has partnerships with the US government. And Emirates, which is in the UAE, is state-owned, and that is their national champion. And I want this concept to really stick because it is essential to understanding why certain airlines receive the level of state investment and strategic support that they do. For a country like the United Arab Emirates, which is relatively small and kind of new, it's seeking to establish itself as a global hub for commerce and especially tourism. And yeah. So building on that, I want to talk about one of the most visible channels through which airlines and their host states project a national identity beyond the airport, and that is sports sponsorship. So sports washing is the use of high-profile sporting partnerships to build international prestige and generate positive associations with that country or brand. And when you think about the sheer scale of global sports viewership, it becomes clear why this is such an effective strategy. So billions of people are watching football, they follow Formula One, they attend sporting events, and they buy merchandise. So sports penetrates cultural spaces that traditional diplomacy and advertising simply can't even reach. So when Emirates sponsors Arsenal Or when Qatar Airways appears on a Barcelona jersey, those logos are not just being seen by airport crowds like a tail fin on an airplane. They're being seen by billions of people watching these matches on television. They're streaming the highlights on their social media, and they're even buying replica jerseys. So a flag, is seen in that airport that day, but a logo on a shirt is seen by a whole global audience. And through that exposure, people develop associations, whether it's good or bad ones, but someone who might never have even thought of Qatar as a country may now associate it with elite football, with global sporting events such as FIFA World Cup, or just kind of the general assumption that they're wealthy and there's a lot of prestige since they're able to afford these sponsorships. To put some numbers behind that, Emirates holds 54 sports sponsorships deals globally, and that includes the naming rights to Arsenal Stadium in London at a cost of £100 million. They have a global partnership with Formula One, and according to the literature, they have 22% of all airline sponsorship deals. So that is an extraordinary concentration of sports visibility for just one single carrier. Qatar Airways holds more than 20 sports sponsorship deals globally, including partnerships with FIFA, a specific football team, and Formula One. The Qatari government has explicitly described sport as a key pillar to the long-term vision of the state of Qatar. And these are not, incidental marketing decisions. They're deliberate strategies tied to national development plans, and they represent some of the most expensive and high-profile branding commitments in global sport. So for both Emirates and Qatar Airways, sports sponsorship is a direct extension of their role as national champion firms and soft power instruments. So with all of these threads of soft power and national identity and ownership models and social media, they all come together in the research question that drives this thesis. And that question is, how do airlines construct and communicate a national identity through their branding systems, and how do these representations shape audience engagement and soft power perception as reflected in social media metrics and visibility? So each concept I have walked through today feeds into this question. We know that states have national identities. We know that these airlines project those national identities. And we know that the way that airlines are owned affects how and why they do that projection in the first place. And we know, of course, that social media is the primary channel through which this projection reaches global audiences. So this thesis attempts to bring all of those elements together and examine them in a data analysis. But the theoretical framework maps the causal pathway that I am proposing. So it begins with the national identity, which is the foundational layer. A state develops a sense of who it is, what its symbols are, what values it wants to project, and then that national identity then shapes the ownership model of the airline because of how strongly a state identifies with and invests in its flag carrier. And it's a function of how central that airline is to the national project. So a state like China or the UAE, where national identity is tightly controlled and centrally directed, produces state-owned carriers. A state like the United Kingdom, which with a stronger tradition of market liberalism and privatization, produces privately owned carriers. With these two factors together, national identity and ownership model, they shape airline branding. So how strongly the airline incorporates these national symbols, what their uniforms look like, what language they use, and how that positions itself visually. That branding then becomes a form of soft power, projecting the nation's image to a global audience. And that soft power is ultimately received and measured through digital reception, meaning the social media platforms where audiences engage with the content. Now, moving on to the methodology, the first part of the research design that I did with my co-director focused on building a comparative profile of the airlines in the sample. So we selected 9 airlines across 3 ownership categories and collected 5 operational metrics. So the annual revenue, the annual passengers, the fleet size, the number of routes, and the cabin crew gender ratio. We wanted to know how large these airlines were and how many people they reach and what their workforce composition is like. And because of all of that, it provides important context for interpreting how and why these brands themselves are the way they are. So the first one, we're starting with cabin crew gender ratios. This chart shows the proportion of female to male cabin crew across the 6 airlines for which data was available. Qatar Airways, Virgin Atlantic, and Air France were excluded because their gender ratio data was not publicly accessible. And looking at the numbers, Cathay Pacific has the highest proportion of female cabin crew at 81%, and Singapore Airlines at 60%. The data set average across these 6 airlines comes out to approximately 70% female and 30% male. Now, the widely cited industry average is 86% female and 14% female. So this sample actually sits below that benchmark. And it may reflect the fact that this sample kind of includes a mix of carriers with different regions and ownership structures, some of which may have more gender balanced recruitment practices than the industry as a whole, like example, Virgin Atlantic. But across the board, women still constitute the majority of cabin crew, which is relevant when we look at how female cabin crew are represented in social media content later on. So this slide shows the 4 other operational metrics across all 9 airlines. So we looked at annual revenue. Air France and Emirates are the clear leaders. They both operate at significantly higher revenue levels than the rest of the sample. In the annual passengers, Air China stands out considerably, carrying over 150 million passengers annually, which is proportionate to their population size, and that's far more than any other airline in the sample. Turkish Airline also carries a large number of passengers relative to its revenue and fleet size, but it does have quite a few routes. For fleet size, Air China again leads with over 500 aircraft, followed by Turkish Airlines, and Air France in the 300 to 400 range. Emirates operates a smaller but highly concentrated fleet of wide-body aircraft, and for number of routes, Turkish Airlines has the most extensive network, and in the sample at over 300 routes, followed by Air France, British Airways, and Air China. Virgin Atlantic is, of course, a considerably smaller carrier, and it sits at the lower end of all the 4 metrics. So the second part of my research design is where I move into the social media analysis, which is where the core kind of statistical component of this thesis sits. So I examined 8 airlines across 2 platforms, and those 2 platforms were TikTok and Instagram. I coded 12 posts per airline per platform for a total of 96 posts per platform. The 6 coded variables were national symbols, if cabin crew were present, if they were female cabin crew centered, luxury content, sports content, and then, of course, the language that the post is in. Air China was excluded from this portion of the analysis because they don't have a they currently don't have an active like TikTok or Instagram account. They do have a Facebook account that is active, and I did collect data from that, but because the other 8 airlines were analyzed on TikTok and Instagram specifically, I thought that introducing the Facebook data for only one airline would have kind of created an inconsistency. So Air China's only other Western social media presence was Twitter, but that has not been active since 2016. And they are, however, very active on Weibo, which is a Chinese platform. And I made the deliberate decision to treat Air China's absence from Western social media as a limitation of the study, but also finding it in its own right, which I will get to later. So this is the first graph that we're looking at, which is national symbol use on Instagram. And we can see a range of approaches across the sample. Emirates and Qatar Airways, as state-owned carriers, both show moderate national symbol use at 5 and 6 posts respectively out of 12. Among the hybrid carriers, Cathay Pacific matches Qatar at 6, while Singapore Airlines is at 5, and Air France and Turkish Airlines sit below at 2 each. So what is particularly interesting that stands out here is British Airways, of course. As a privately owned airline with no state ownership, British Airways scored 7 out of 12 for national symbol use on Instagram, which is higher than any state-owned carrier in the sample. They use the Union Jack prominently and frequently across their Instagram content, And this kind of complicates the assumption that state ownership would predict a higher national symbol use. So in this sample, specifically on this platform, this is not what we see. On TikTok, the picture kind of shifts somewhat. So Emirates, of course, leads national symbol use with 6 out of 12 posts containing national symbols, which is the highest out of any airline in this platform. Turkish Airlines also scores relatively high at 5. Qatar Airways, by contrast, drops to just 2 on TikTok, which is notably lower than their Instagram presence. The difference between these platforms for the same airline is potentially meaningful because it suggests that the airlines may be making platform-specific content decisions. Emirates' higher national symbol use on TikTok compared to some other carriers could reflect a deliberate strategy to leverage TikTok's younger, more global audience for identity content. But without accessing their internal marketing strategy, that remains an interpretation rather than a confirmed finding. So this chart gives us a broader overview of how the 6 coded variables are distributed across airlines on TikTok. And what stands out immediately is that there are no 2 airlines that kind of have the same content mix. Each airline has a distinct content fingerprint. Emirates leans very heavily into the national symbols and female cabin crew imagery. Air France is dominated by luxury signaling, with 7 out of the 12 posts coded for luxury content, which is far above any other airline. Singapore Airlines had very minimal coded content across all variables, with most of their posts not fitting neatly into any of the 6 categories. Cathay Pacific showed a relatively even spread across the national symbols, and Virgin Atlantic leaned primarily into female cabin crew imagery. The variation here reinforces the idea that these airlines are not all pursuing the same branding strategy, even when they occupy similar market positions or ownership categories. So the luxury signaling data did produce one of the more unexpected findings in the study. Air France scored 7 out of 12 on both Instagram and TikTok, which is substantially higher than any other airlines in the sample. Emirates, which is widely perceived as one of the most luxurious airlines in the world, scored lower, as did Qatar Airways. Now, this does require some context, since a significant portion of Air France's luxury content was food related, and they were specifically related to Michelin star chefs and restaurants that they were partnering with to create the menu for the airlines. And airlines with active culinary sponsorship agreements are contractually obligated to post that content, which means the high score may reflect partnership commitments as much as a deliberate luxury branding strategy. So this snapshot of 12 posts per platform can't distinguish between strategic nation branding decisions and content that exists primarily to fulfill a sponsorship obligation. That being said, the general assumption that Emirates and Qatar Airways would dominate luxury signaling and social media is not supported what I found in this particular sample, which is noteworthy even if the explanation is partly structural. Looking at the female cabin crew centered imagery across both platforms, Cathay Pacific, Emirates, and Virgin Atlantic emerged as the airlines with the highest frequency of posts centering female and cabin crew. Cathay Pacific scored 5 on Instagram and 4 on TikTok. Emirates scored 4 on Instagram and 5 on TikTok. Virgin scored 5 on both. So what is interesting here, of course, is Singapore Airlines. Given what we talked about earlier about the historical centrality of Singapore Airlines in Singapore Airlines, the Singapore girl in Singapore Airlines' brand identity, and given the extensive literature on the Singapore girl as a marketing icon, you might expect Singapore Airlines to be one of the strongest performers on this variable, but they weren't. So Singapore Airlines did score relatively low for female cabin crew centered imagery on both platforms. Of course, this could be a number of things. It could reflect a deliberate shift in that kind of image, but it could be a feature of the particular 12 posts that were sampled. On the sports content, Qatar Airways stands out with 4 sports-related TikTok posts, which is the highest of any airline in the sample. That is consistent with what we know about Qatar Airways' extensive sports sponsorship portfolio. Emirates, of course, also showed sports content, though less prominently than on TikTok, than you might expect given their 54 sponsorship deals. One detail worth noting is Cathay Pacific, which had 3 sports-related posts on TikTok, and these posts were connected to the Hong Kong Sevens rugby tournament, and interestingly, several of them featured female rugby players. So that is a different kind of sports content from the football and Formula One or FIFA associated with the Emirates and Qatar Airways posts. And it might reflect a different sporting culture and sponsorship strategy tied to Cathay Pacific's Hong Kong base. So another thing I looked at was, of course, the language of the posts. And as we can see here, English dominates across both platforms and across nearly all airlines, regardless of the home market or the ownership structure. English is the lingua franca of the business world and clearly one of the aviation industry as well. Every airline in the sample posted predominantly in English. There are, however, very few notable exceptions. Cathay Pacific, over there on the left, was the most distinctive, with every single Instagram post appearing both in Cantonese and English. So that bilingual approach was seeming to be consistent and deliberate, and it reflects Cathay Pacific's Hong Kong identity in a way that no other airline in the sample replicated. Air France also included posts in both English and French, with at least one post appearing entirely in French. But beyond those two, even the state-owned carriers whose home markets are Arabic-speaking or Mandarin-speaking posted overwhelmingly in English. Emirates and Qatar Airways did not lean heavily into Arabic in their social media content, which is potentially significant. So it may suggest that their social media strategy is oriented, of course, towards international tourism and global brand recognition rather than domestic or regional audiences like Air China would be. So English in this context becomes a tool for capturing the widest possible audience. Looking at the engagement, Emirates led TikTok with an average of 160,498 likes per post, and Singapore Airlines led Instagram with an average of 83,755 likes per post. So these are significant numbers by any standard, and they speak to the scale of audience that the airline's social media content reaches. So what this tells us is that social media is not, a side thought for these airlines. It is a primary one, and the volume of engagement that these carriers command points to an audience that is already primed and very attentive. And the sheer scale at which these airlines operate on social media makes these platforms an essential piece of branding infrastructure. So national identity content posted on these platforms is not just visible given these engagement figures, it is reaching and resonating with very large audiences. So whether that engagement translates directly into soft power perception is this question that the study can't fully answer, but the reach is there and it seems to be substantial. Finally, I have my key takeaways. First, ownership. What I've taken from this thesis is that ownership does not necessarily predict nationalism. We saw with British Airways, a privately owned airline, deployed the Union Jack more frequently than any state-owned carrier on Instagram. So that the assumption that state ownership automatically produces higher national symbol use does not hold in this sample, but of course the Union Jack is on the tail fin of the British Airways airplane, so that is also a factor. Second, the feminized body carries the brand, so female cabin crew remain the single most consistent visual device in airline digital content. Across the sample, women were the primary figures through which airlines communicated their brand identity on social media. Third is English is the default lingua franca of airline branding. Nearly every airline posted predominantly in English across both platforms, regardless of home market or ownership structure. Fourth, the sponsorship obligations shape content. Air France's dominant luxury signaling score was driven largely by the culinary partnership commitments, which is a reminder that not all social media content reflects a deliberate brand strategy. Some of it, of course, is contractual. Fifth, engagement reflects accumulated brand equity. Emirates and Singapore Airlines led engagement on their respective platforms, which likely reflects decades of brand recognition and audience cultivation, rather than any type of, revolutionary content strategy. And sixth, platform absence itself is a soft power signal. So Air China missing from Instagram and TikTok, is not accidental. It is, of course, it reflects China's separate digital ecosystem, and it raises broader questions about how states that operate outside the Western social media platforms project soft power in their own digital spaces. And of course, I do want to be transparent about the limitations of the study. Of course, the sample size is very small, 12 posts per airline. Per platform captures a very small snapshot, and it's not a comprehensive strategy. It is entirely possible that a larger sample would produce different distributions across the coded variable, and I want to be careful not to overstate what the 12 posts can tell us about an airline's overall approach. And second, I recorded comment volumes but did not conduct any analysis of comment content. So that means I can tell you how many comments a post received, but I cannot tell you whether those comments were entirely enthusiastic, critical, or maybe even completely unrelated to the content of the post. So engagement volume and engagement quality are, of course, not the same thing. Third, Air China was excluded. This is my biggest limitation from the social media analysis for the reasons I did describe earlier. Their absence from TikTok and Instagram itself is a meaningful finding, however, but it does mean that the state-owned category in the social media data is represented only by 2 airlines rather than 3. And fourth, there is kind of a seasonal bias in the data. I did collect my data in February 2026, right as the start of Chinese New Year started. So the Instagram data collection period coincided with Chinese New Year, which appears to kind of have skewed a little bit the Cathay Pacific data, as several of their posts, a few of their posts during that window were specifically themed around the holiday, which did include more national symbols. If I were to continue this study at a postgraduate level, the most immediate extension would be that I would do a sentiment analysis, because I think that seeing the opinions of the consumers and reviews from the consumers in the comments would be more of a qualitative analysis. And I think it's more uh, significant than just seeing the comment volume. And a longitudinal study tracking the same airlines across a full calendar year or even across multiple years would help address the snapshot limitation and allow us to see content strategies shift over time around holidays and geopolitical events and even new sponsorship deals. And of course, the biggest thing, a broader regional scope would be more valuable. So this sample focused on a specific set of carriers, and it's missing airlines that represent enormous populations in important geopolitical contexts. Air India, for instance, represents a country of over 1 billion people and has recently undergone a major ownership transition. Air China, as I mentioned, represents another billion plus population, but cannot be included in the social media analysis because of platform availability. Other airlines I would have loved to have included would be Ethiopian Airlines, Lufthansa, Pakistan International Airlines, etc. And all of these would add important regional perspectives. And finally, examining passenger reviews on platforms like TripAdvisor and Google Reviews could offer a way to test whether the national narrative airlines construct in their branding actually match the experience passengers report having. So that would kind of close the loop between projection and reception in a way that this study was kind of limited at doing. But this is an undergraduate thesis, and that scope kind of reflects that. This is my works cited. And this is my thank you. Thank you to Dr. Hannah for inspiring this. Thank you to Dr. Georgette for guiding me as my director. Thank you to Shirvin for working very closely with me. And thank you to Dr. Mark Haas for supporting this.
Thank you, Olivia. Very well done. Clap, clap, clap. I'm sure.
Great job with your presentation.
Well done.
All right. So could we now open the floor to questions, comments, other comments from those in attendance?
Yes, everyone is very much qualified to ask questions now that you have learned.
Well, I have a comment first, if I can start.
Okay.
I found the written thesis to be very interesting. I thought that
Oh, really?
I think you captured a lot of good information, You presented it clearly. It's a complex topic, and you can possibly be expected to kind of wrap your arms around all of it. And we talked about that, about how important it was to limit this, or you spend
Mm-hmm.
the rest of your life studying the different variables for marketing airlines. But I just want to call you out for the quality of the literature review and the
Thank
quality
you.
of your synthesis of it. I mean, you presented it in a nice, clear, readable way, which
Thank you.
for a reader, for someone who deals with these quite often, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Uh,
I know there's people who should be asking
Yeah,
questions.
any
I'm
other
waiting for
comments?
them to. Where are the people who are asking questions?
Uh, I have a question.
Oh my God, do you?
I
Devin!
do. Hi, I will come off camera. Um, this was great, Olivia. Thank you so much for sharing. I know this is a passion area.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious because we curate our own images all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you really talked about the curation. I'm wondering if you came across any that were curating things that actually were going against what the country really stands for.
Wow, Devin, thank you. That's a wonderful question. I think that branding is not a fully transparent window into a country. I think that it's definitely heavily curated. They've got a whole marketing team. They want to make it look as nice as possible. One of the things that I found with my literature review was in relation to Emirates Airlines and Qatar Airways. Qatar Airways and Emirates kind of project this luxurious and prestigious brand, but if you look into kind of the news, you'll see that there's some human rights abuses or even domestic labor laws that are questionable. And that was kind of something where, there's a big class difference between the real population and then the population that they're curating their branding to. So thank you for that question.
Thanks for the explanation.
Hi, I have a question as
Hi.
well. I wanted to first congratulate you because this was very well put together.
Thank you.
You're obviously quite passionate about it and very knowledgeable. But you had mentioned like wanting to do further analysis on,
Hmm.
how things change over the seasons and like geopolitical events. So I wanted to
Uh-huh.
know if you had any like possible predictions over how like Emirates and Qatar would shift their marketing strategy now that we have conflict in the Middle East and
Hmm.
kind of how that would devolve.
Yeah, that is a good question. Yeah, it's very relevant to right now because when you go onto the Qatar Airways website, they actually say we're running on a limited schedule right now. And I think they're more about kind of keeping safety in the thoughts of the passengers and the consumers. I think, of course, it is limited, but they want people to be feeling like, no, we're safe, they're well under control. And I'm interested to see as well. Like I think they've updated their posts. I saw it while I was I was collecting the data, and I saw that some of them had said, like British Airways, for example, they said we're running on a limited schedule. We're looking to see the forecast of events, and we'll give you updates as soon as we have news.
Maybe I'll jump in and ask a couple of things now.
Okay.
So first and foremost, it's something I think I should have addressed with you a bit earlier on before we got to this. You mentioned these 12 posts that you've taken from each one. Can you explain where did you choose those from? Were they the 12 most popular posts that had comments on? Were they the 12 most recent posts that an airline had gone through? I'm interested as to how you chose those in particular.
Okay. So those 12, they were the most recent at the time, which was February. I think the latest I took was February 23rd, and they were non-pinned, so none of them were pinned. I chose the organic ones. And yeah, they were just the most recent. Some of the airlines post very frequently. Virgin Atlantic, for example, had posts going all the way back to November. So it was all the way through Christmas and everything that I had taken posts in.
Okay. Because again, I think going forward, if you want to expand that, I would be looking revising how you took those. And I have to say, hats off to you for everything that you've done, but also everything that you've actively considered going forward, because I think everybody here today would agree that this is a very intriguing and very kind of interesting and relevant kind of topic. And
Hmm.
I would recommend, and I hope you have the passion and the desire to take this further. I would I'm looking at taking something like this to the next,
Hmm.
potentially in some kind of postgraduate level when you move forward. It'll be,
Oh, thank you, Shirvin. I'll be honest, I never want to see an airline again, but I will consider it if I apply to graduate school.
yeah, sure, sure. And I mean, a couple of other comments. I mean,
Okay.
I think the luxury branding, I think
Mm-hmm.
potentially missed a slight trick here when it came to that online, because many of these airlines, when you speak of luxury branding, they're actually talking about their product as well. So
Mm-hmm.
this day and age, the service you receive on board an aircraft is labeled as a product. So
Uh-huh.
a business class suite, a particular service. I mean, Air France pride themselves on being the world's number one first class airline, whereas Qatar Airways pride themselves on being number one business class airlines based on those products and services that.
Right.
So it's the actual product itself which could potentially be considered as a luxury. And I think there's a lot,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of scope there to look into how that's branded. Again, these are all things to go kind of moving forward. But
Mm-hmm.
push back on, I think one thing you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you said that social media is by all means the number one kind of method of communicating and conveying this. But I would actually
Uh-huh.
agree and push back and say that what about countries? I mean, India, for example, as you mentioned, a huge population and one of the most prominent users of Emirates and Qatar Airways. Um,
Uh-huh.
not everybody has access to social media. Not everybody accesses the computer in
That
that way.
is true. TikTok is banned there.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
There are some countries, in fact, where many social media platforms are banned. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there are still the more traditional newspaper adverts. There are the sporting events. Don't
Mm-hmm.
forget, 1.45 billion people in India and Pakistan are huge fans of cricket, and cricket's obviously
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. So again, excellent work all round. I think you should consider the alternatives outside of social media as well moving forward.
Okay.
That would be worth mentioning on there. But overall, I've thoroughly enjoyed working with you on this. I think it's a
Oh,
fascinating,
thank you.
and yeah, best of luck moving forward.
Thank you. The frog at the end was for you, by the way. I don't know if you
Yes,
saw
thank
that.
you. Yes,
Yeah.
ribbit, ribbit.
Hi, Livy.
Oh,
Amazing presentation.
thank
Um,
you.
I, I particularly loved how you explored the various aspects of aesthetic labor. I had a quick
Mhm.
question. There have been quite a few airline incidents and scary plane crashes in the recent years, more so in the recent years than before. And I've noticed that a lot of airlines frequently feature flight attendants in videos or social media posts aimed at damage control. So, how do you
Mhm.
feel about this kind of aesthetic labor where their emotional performance helps to soften corporate accountability? Proud of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gory. I do think that flight attendants are trained for this kind of disaster, and I think that, when they present themselves, they're there to make people feel safe, they're kind, they can keep people calm in a disaster or an emergency. And of course, I don't think it's their responsibility to, take blame for whatever disaster happened, but using them as the placeholder instead of a CEO is definitely much more, how would you say it? Like, not only is it aesthetically much better, I mean, I think it's also just more calming and it just, yeah, it just looks better if they use these kind of stand-ins for these disasters.
If I could jump in with a
Okay.
comment first to follow on what Shervin was talking about, and then also a
Hmm.
question.
Okay.
Comment first is why social media, and Olivia and I discussed this,
Hmm.
and social media is, in my opinion, and I think many would agree, is the tool, is the channel that allows a brand to become relevant. You know, I,
Hmm.
I think that if a brand is not relevant on social media and relevant in that mess that defines social media, it is not culturally relevant. It is not relevant with a broad group of consumers. It really is the platform that reaches the most people. So to
Hmm.
streamline kind of the research, it's a good proxy for everything, right? So that's my comment about that, and so I'm a big fan of using social media as a way to
Hmm.
determine brand relevance. Um, the question, Olivia, that I have is that I think you did a wonderful job looking at thinking about how brands use how countries use airlines to represent their brand, the country brand.
Hmm.
But of course, there's also a business incentive, right? In everything
Right.
they do, right? They got to make money. They have to fly profitably. Can you talk about, have you thought at all about how these airlines balance the business needs along with their national branding needs?
That's a good question. Do you mind going a little bit further, like give me an example?
Well, if your assumption is that Singapore Air is using the airline
Hmm.
to brand Singapore as a desirable, sophisticated cultural
Hmm.
spot in Asia, how are how are these posts, the advertisements, the brand building, how is that driving business success? And how important is business success versus national origin?
Right. I think that when they have merchandise, like when they did that sarong kabaya, I think that was really interesting. I've heard that it has been sold in gift shops even. And I think that, they, by making themselves more luxurious as well, that's also another thing. You see a lot of people on YouTube review Emirates and Qatar Airways just because of how massive their suites are, that they have a shower in the first class, and people are intrigued by that. They want to experience it firsthand. And I think just by promoting these little cultural artifacts as well makes people more intrigued to see that country. And I think that does increase profits, but I don't know, I'd have to see in further research.
Yeah, it's a different thesis.
Hmm.
Thank
Are
you.
we done with questions, everybody, or do we have more?
I was just going to ask, are there any further
Oh,
questions from anyone in the audience?
I'm still
anyone?
push back a touch, Mark, on that because again, I still think social media.
Shirvin.
I think social media is a great platform and everything, but I still think it's relevant to where in the world we're targeting and age groups as well. God bless him.
Mhm.
You put a Twitter account or something in front of him, he won't know what to do with it. So it just depends on the influencers and who you're targeting and where you're targeting. But again, there's a whole kind of category out there of non-social media users, but there's an
Mhm.
undoubtedly in the future as we move forward, we'll
Mhm.
push heavily on social media and but great. I love these the business approach, Mark, and the it's something we don't embrace necessarily well in the School of Politics. So it's fascinating that that business question was very, very good as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we've done enough for questions for Olivia at this point. I mean, congratulating her first of all on her wonderful presentation and the engaging discussion that we've had so far. I'm just going to quickly move across to a breakout room with the committee, meeting with Olivia, just to quickly talk about her written report. You're welcome to wait. We should not be that long, but you're welcome to wait in the room. And when we return, we'll confer our decision for Olivia. Okay, so I've created the room. So if everyone could join, Olivia, are you seeing to join the room?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, go ahead and join.
yeah.
few minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So our meeting was very productive, very short, because we were all in agreement that Olivia did a wonderful job. There's some things that we wanted to address in the report, but this is nothing that would change our decision. It's more about detail that we think she should include. Yes, so please join us in congratulating Olivia on the successful defense of her thesis work. Congratulations, Olivia.
Bravo.
Okay, very well done.
Well, thank you.
Okay. All right. If you have any final words, it's kind of like the end here.
No, I want to say thank you to Shirvin. He was very helpful. We met multiple times throughout the week, through the months, and yeah, he was very supportive. And of course, everyone has been supportive. Thank you, Dr. Hannah, as well. You gave me this idea in April or March of last year. So thank
Oh,
you.
with pleasure, Olivia. Right. I would say, sorry, one thing I forgot to, well, I didn't get a chance to mention during the Q&A is
Hmm.
you've been a wonderful icon of American soft power last year wearing the class. Yeah, so I will have the teaching tomorrow, then I'll let the rest of the class know about you
Oh, thank
and your work.
you.
Great. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Olivia, we'll continue to meet to just tidy up some of these things before you submit your final project.
Okay, are we meeting personally one-on-one?
Yes, with the
Okay,
rest of our meetings, our
okay,
usual. Okay. All right. Thank you,
okay.
everyone.
Thank
Well done,
you.
Olivia.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Bye.